So what's happened in the last 5 years? We lived on our boat, Gray Matter, in Bahia, San Carlos for a year while we established ourselves legally so that we could stay in the country at least until COVID sorted itself out, and so that we could again look to our options for earning an income and doing so legally. A lot of people will come to Mexico and moonlight, right? You know, I'll just call it moonlighting. There's a lot of folks that come down here and work under the table and operate a business, including brokerages, without any real legal standing in Mexico. And that's not something that Morgan and I are an advocate of. Our values are such that we did not feel right about, you know, trying to sneak around and earn money under the table. Even while we were in Mexico before COVID, I would obviously, like I mentioned, I would fly away and go back up to Canada and make money and unfortunately pay tax on it. And but at least it was honest work and it was honest income. So we wanted to do that right while staying in Mexico, and so we've now set ourselves up to do that and be able to hold our head high and create a business and create a brand that we could stand behind and not have to sneak around in the shadows or worry, look over your shoulder that, you know, is Hacienda gonna come for us? You know, these kind of things. So at this point, we've been living on our boat in the Bahia for a year and made arrangements to haul the boat out in Guaymas at a place affectionately known as Gabriel's, named for the owner of the yard. And we hauled the boat out there and began assessing that project that we'd known we'd need to get to, addressing the bottom, paint and barrier coat. And in doing so, we learned that we'd begun the process of assessing the condition of the bottom. Like I said, we'd had a number of paint failures and bare steel under the water. And so I began with a scraper and a chipping hammer and whatnot, going around and popping paint blisters and removing rust spots and seeing just what do we have. Do we have significant pitting of the hull? Some of you will recall we had to haul out in San Francisco, San Rafael, and do some fairly significant repairs around the rudder where we had bad steel. And I had to cut out and do some smaller replating and redesign the gussets around the rudder posts. And so this wasn't our first foray into some problem spots on that boat. So assessing the boat, removing the suspect areas of paint and scraping some rust blisters on the bottom of the hull, we immediately opened up a hole right below a section of plating where previous repairs had been done, where a large doubler plate, as it's known, was welded onto the outside of the hull, because at a point many years ago, probably about a decade before we bought the boat, there was obviously some concern about thickness of the hull plating underneath of the fuel tank on the port side in particular. The starboard side was largely fine, and very little indication of rust from the interior as well, because it's fairly common knowledge that steel boats rust from the inside out, which is true and not true, but for the argument's sake, for the purpose of this video, let's assume that's largely true. And it was apparent from the interior of the boat that under the port fuel tanks, where you had no access to treat the steel or treat the paint barriers, the bilge paint, it was apparent that there was clearly rusting issues going on. But the assumption that, based on our inspections and our survey when we bought the boat, was that they were aware of this problem and they'd at least long-term temporarily solved that by welding a doubler plate on outside of the hull where this problem area was. Immediately below the doubler plate, I was able to chip open basically a hole.
Here's what you should not be able to do on your steel hull.
With alarmingly little effort. And it became very apparent that the fix of this doubler plate was inadequate. And I'd always thought that it's not the best way, it's not the most correct way to deal with that problem. So I'd always thought that at a point in the future, if we were going to continue to own gray matter, that we would want to remove that section of bad steel and properly weld in a new plate of steel. And finding that the stopgap measure that this doubler plate was didn't even address the full extent of the wasting steel, that immediately below it, like I'm talking 3-4 inches below the plate, I could poke a hole through the boat in an area that was not accessible from the interior, underneath the fuel tank. This was a moment of holy shit for Morgan and I, and a realization that if we were going to keep this boat, now would be the time for us to address these problems and do it right, which would involve very, very significant project. This would involve us removing the water tanks from atop the diesel tanks out of the boat. In order to do that, that required us to remove the entire salon settee and bump up floor box for the salon. It's a raised salon. Remove that, then remove the sole, the cabin sole from the raised pilot house, so that we could then pull the water tanks up and out of the boat, through the floor, out the companionway and off the side of the boat, in order to get to the fuel tanks, very large diesel tanks where we had nearly 200 gallons, so about 100 gallons per tank. Each tank would have weighed probably in excess of 300 pounds. They were too large and too heavy for us to be able to remove those tanks in one piece. So the job became literally taking them out a piece at a time. We drained all the diesel off our tanks and put them under drums, or put the diesel in drums under the boat, and a number of containers, whatever we could get our hands on. Of course, dilute whatever remaining fuel residue that was in the tank with water. So, basically fill the tanks up and drain them several times, just to try and get off as much fuel as possible, so that we could safely cut the tanks up without creating a fire. And I've had some pretty terrible jobs in my life, working in factories, working underneath train cars in -20, -30, hooking up hoppers to the bottom of train cars and vibrating off bentonite powder out of these trains into a giant. Anyway, so I've done some pretty nasty work, and without a doubt, cutting up those diesel tanks was probably one of the worst jobs I've ever done. With an angle grinder, sparks shooting in your face, and diesel fuel smoking and filling up the whole area with basically diesel combustion, like diesel fumes. Very, very terrible work to do in order to remove these tanks a piece at a time, and I had to do that twice. Just so we could then see what the state of the hull was underneath these tanks. And of course, once we had access from the inside, it was again very apparent that the state of the steel was completely wasted. and very badly,
Adhered?
very badly corroded. Rust scale, very, very thick rust scale that basically when you removed the scale, you could put your finger through the hull. It was seriously that close to the line where we're just grateful that an errant bottom cleaning swipe of anything impacting the hull didn't somehow hole our boat in a significant way, where again we would struggle to have to try and stop a leak that we didn't have access to. We'd have to jump out into the water and somehow try to father the hole or plug it with an epoxy or something like that. A nightmare. And so in many ways we were very lucky considering some of the conditions that we came down the coast in, and the forces that were on the boat, that we got here safely and we had the opportunity to haul the boat out and find that problem on the hard and not realize that problem in the water. So the determination was made that now is the time, we need to cut this bad steel out. And so a process of assessing the rest of the area ensued. And of course, when you're welding plate up to other plate, it needs to be good quality steel that you're welding up to. So the realization was that there was scale happening, pitting happening inside this whole area, in particular the port side, from where they previously addressed some long-term leaks that they had. And I don't understand it. This is a bone of contention I have with the previous owners. And you know, anyone can slag previous owners, and I mean, people deal with what they have, with what they're given at that time. But my suspicion is that the previous owners were quite advanced in age by the time we bought the boat, and that there was conditions that they were unwilling to deal with. I mean, when you're in your late 70s, it's very difficult to be on your hands and knees working in a bilge. So the result was that they had long-term leaks that they, to their credit, disclosed when we bought the boat was the precipitating cause of them needing to do the replating that they had done underneath the galley and forward head. So they said we had a leak in the forward head, and we had a leak in our water maker that they were either unaware of or just neglected, which I'm thinking is probably the latter, that they just knew it was a drip of salt water, and they're like, nah, it's not sinking the boat, and we'll live with it. And they did. The problem is that we also now had to live with this, and the result was that the areas where they'd fixed was fine, but all the rest of the port side, where water would accumulate in the lowest part of the belly of the boat, and particularly, namely under this diesel tank, we now had pitting in this whole area. And like I said, in order for me to weld in new steel, I'm not going to weld up 4.7 mil to 3.5 mil, where that 3.5 mil may be thick enough to go another 20 years, but it's now badly pitted. So by the time you grind out any rust that's in there, you've now got down to maybe 3 mils of steel that's clean, bright steel that you can weld up, and now you've got 2 different gauges of steel that you're trying to weld together, and heat distortion, all this kind of thing. So it becomes like a snowball where you're like, okay, well, if we cut this plate out, the next piece isn't really great steel, so let's cut that piece out, and eventually you find yourself back up to where they'd replated originally. So I'm welding up to, you know, 10-year-old steel instead of 30-year-old steel, which is basically what happened. So we began the process of cutting out the plates and making the decision that rather than trying to treat old steel and having lower than spec steel, we would just cut out anything that was rusty. And that's what we did. We cut out 60 square feet of hull plating, most of that being on the port side, but we also, although the starboard side was largely fine, it was the same situation where I figured it was probably a time savings, and labor savings to just cut out the pitted steel. Even though it was thick enough, it would get kind of thin towards the stringers, but still at least 3.5 mil in spots. And I bought an ultrasounding machine so I could check the thicknesses where I could. And but the decision was, look, like if we're going to keep this boat, let's do this right. So we'd also removed a large panel of steel from the starboard side and replated all of these bad areas. That process of replating took us a year in the yard. A very, very difficult year. And I mean, we're talking about welding in the Sonoran Desert throughout all months of the year, where it would be 110 degrees. And there was days where it was just unsafe to work, it'd be too hot, but I'd basically work up to 93 degrees. And we, of course, don't have a shop. The boat is outside in the desert, and we'd create a makeshift tarp structure around the area that I was welding, because I was MIG welding with gas. So it needed to be sheltered enough that I'm not blowing away my shielding gas. And so now I'm in full denim, right? I'm wearing like a denim welding jacket, and I've got full pants on because, you know, MIG welding's sparkly. You get rained on with molten steel, and in an enclosed area, fully dressed head to toe. It's 93 degrees out, and it's probably 103 degrees inside of this tent enclosure. So anything beyond 93, that was through trial and error. I'd weld, and I'd be like, okay, I'm okay if it's 92, if it's 93, if it's hotter than 93, I'm feeling woozy, like I'm gonna pass out, and I would literally be soaked, like I just jumped in the water, like completely soaked head to toe with sweat, where I could grab my sleeve of my jacket and wring it out like I just jumped in the water. It was a very, very hard year. Physically, existentially, emotionally, it was hard on our marriage, because we basically at that point hauled our boat out and we're living in our boat in a very dirty, dusty boatyard in what could be described as less than ideal conditions. You know, having showers with cockroaches the size of chihuahuas running around your feet. You know, it's not a pleasant reality. And for anyone buying a boat, these are the realities you don't hear about a lot on YouTube. Some people try and do a good job of conveying the difficulties that they have. A lot of it's over dramatized. You know, they start crying because their water maker stopped working or something, and I get it, it's frustrating, but you know, there's levels of hell that the cruising lifestyle will visit you with, and it's a coin toss. I could talk for hours about this. It's a coin toss. You can do all your due diligence and blame your surveyor and blame your broker when stuff goes wrong, but there's really nothing you can do but make an educated, informed guess that you're buying a boat that you can handle with the budget you have. And that's what we did. We spent $100,000 on gray matter, US, $100,000. And frankly, I regret the purchase. I don't regret the experience. I just wish I could go back and do it with a different boat, because it would have changed the course of our life again. Gray matter, like I said earlier, the boat decided where we were going to go and what was going to happen with our life. And that's the coin toss. Because it's an imperfect science. It's not even anything like a science. It's an imperfect world. It's an imperfect life. It's humans engineering complex systems and machinery to try and survive and stand up against forces of the universe. We're talking about water sloshing around on a globe, spinning through space around a star that's traveling through the universe. It's mind-boggling when you think of the scales of what it means to put a boat into the ocean or into a sea and go sailing in these environments. The ocean's the harshest environment on this planet, and it really is probably one of the harshest environments in a solar system, other than like super gaseous planets or some damn thing. But I'm talking about planets that can sustain complex life forms. It's pretty fascinating when you think of what sailing around an ocean really means. We are now living on our boat in Guaymas, every day cutting steel out and grinding steel and trying to figure out, without the industrial infrastructure. It's an industrial port, so there's a lot. It afforded us the ability to buy steel locally, for me to obtain welding consumables. I bought, we had a welder on the boat from when we left San Rafael, and I bought another welder, a 3-process welder that included, so it gave me the ability to MIG weld. And for the nerds out there, it was an Everlast Lightning MTS 275. So there you go. Great machine, I love it, I still have it. And so we're figuring out how to bend up plating, all right? And this is not easy without industrial size, and it's 3/16 steel, so 4.75 millimeters of mild steel. It's not easy to bend. It's tough stuff. I mean, it's easier than stainless or titanium, but it's tough to bend. And I didn't have a roller, and we have a radius chine on our boat, so we literally had to use some very creative ingenuity to achieve this and bend these plates up to fit the shape of the hull, a compound curve of a hull as it's changing. And when Bruce Roberts designed these boats, he designed cutting files, and the steel was cut in a factory and pre-bent as per the plan. So you'd get a pallet with all these numbered pieces of plate that you basically put together like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and weld it together. And in hindsight, again, it's almost one of those things where I kind of wish I had obtained a plan and tried to cut out the plates exactly as they were, like a piece of the plan, which would be crazy hard in itself, and then have those pieces shipped to me and weld those up. Because what we had to do, without being able to roll the steel just to get the right radius, I used bottle jacks and the rear point of the keel, and drew out a grid iron, like a grid pattern on these plates of steel, and then incrementally bent them. And then anyone who's ever worked with steel will know that if you bend one piece, it'll affect the other part of the plate. If you bend it here, so if you bend it this way, and then you try and bend it this way, it'll flatten it out this way. So it's really hard to make a compound curve with steel without very heavy-duty industrial equipment that basically stretches and pulls the steel. And we didn't have that ability. All we could do was bend it each point for point. And my wife weighs 120 pounds, taking these big 100-pound plates of steel and jacking them up. I used a ratchet strap, and we would try and lift it up into place with the ratchet strap, and then move it around and see how close the fit up was, and then lower it down, and by eye and trial and error, continue to try and bend it until it was largely the right shape, and then tack it in and dog and wedge it dogs and wedges and jack stands and hammering to get the plates to fit up as near perfect as I could. Near perfect is a hard thing for me because good isn't good enough, and that's part of the reason for my tattoos that say good enough is almost like a permission and forgiveness to yourself for doing the best you can with what you have and accepting that, just accepting that. So the first approach was to take plates that were the full size of the holes we cut and start from the bottom and tack them up and bend them up into place. Just forcing them up, heating and pushing and torturing, is the term, torturing the plates into place. And the problem was you could get the roll, the right sort of dimension going up the hull. But as you, like I said earlier, as you bend it this way, it wants to flatten it out the other way. So I actually would have like a good curvature of the hull, but it would actually be somewhat concaved lengthwise. So I want this going lengthwise, and I want this going up the side of the hull, height-wise. So I'd get a good radius, but it would be flat. And then the next plate would bend up and it'd be a good radius, but then it was like flat sections coming together, right? Coming together and not being a nice compound curve in both axes, X and Y. So this was very frustrating because I don't do things half-ass, I do things whole-ass. After we'd done all this work, I made the decision, and again, this was another one where I was like, if you do this, this might be the end of our marriage because I don't know how much more I can take, which is fair because it was miserable. But after some discussions and agreement, it was decided, let's cut the top half. So basically just below where the radius, so the flat part was fine. We could cut just below where the radius starts up to where it ended, cut that section back out, and then try and bend up just that smaller section. Which again, back to my earlier comments, was more like how the boat was constructed. So you would have had flat panels and then you would have had pre-formed steel panels that would form the radius part, and then largely flat hull sides and so on. And that was the realization, like, okay, I'm making this harder on myself, so instead of doing one large plate, bending it, we'll do one flat plate and then one smaller plate, 1/3 size, say. That was just the radius part of the hull. And that's what we did. So 3 large 4-foot by 5-foot plates, cut almost half of those back out. So all that work that we've done to get to that point, cut them back out. And then by hand, using bottle jacks, hydraulic jacks, and the point on the bottom of our keel, shaped 3 radius panels, one after the other. Finish one, tack it up, weld it up, and then move to the next panel. That process took us a year. After about 3.5 months of living aboard the boat, friends of ours had recently bought a house at that time in San Carlos. It's basically the fancy part of town. It's the large mansions that are owned by wealthy Americans and wealthy Mexicans that come on vacation in Mexico or spend their snowbird months in Mexico. So these folks had just bought this wonderful, beautiful, we call it the mansion, over the point with a lighthouse on the end and a 360 view of the Sea of Cortez and Bahia San Carlos. And they said, look, you guys are living on your boat, that's absolutely terrible. Why don't you come house sit for us? And at least you have a place you can relax and have a shower without cockroaches running over your feet, and somewhere to lay your head at night between when you're working at the boat. And this was a really unique opportunity for us. And again, another junction in the road on this journey we are on, where we had we were borrowing a different lifestyle for a minute, if that makes any sense. We were suddenly privy to what it's like to have a house again, a house in Mexico, a chance to relax, and over time, a realization that what we're doing on this boat isn't anything that we ever initially intended on doing. We never intended on buying a $100,000 boat to haul it out and spend a year in the desert doing grueling, like prison labor type work, grinding steel and welding. The welding part's fantastic. I actually really enjoy welding, but the grinding and cutting steel and bending steel and the dust blowing into your eyes and, tarantulas and scorpions running around your feet, and it's tough, man. It was so tough. And now here we are. We come home from the boatyard and have a shower, and then go jump in a jacuzzi tub with this view over Bahia San Carlos and the Sea of Cortez. And after a year of that time in the boatyard and 3.5 months living in the boat, we have this juxtaposed reality with this mansion that we're living in. And a taste of the finer things, at least in our surroundings, right? While at the same time we're starting up a business brokering boats. So a couple things happen at this point in our life where I gotta hit the stop here because it's probably really long.